This episode is part of a long season exploring how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. Now that our big topic is nearing its end, I want to revisit some of the characters from the season to see where they landed. This one can stand on its own, but may make more sense if you go to my episodes about Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell. This is Where the Gang Ended Up, Part 2. In the years between the Old Testament and the New, things weren't great for the Jewish people. Sure, they'd rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem.
Woo, that was a lot of work!
But they were also taken over by a series of different empires. The Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, Romans. Like, everyone in the region wanted a turn at occupying Israel. They made some attempts at independence, notably the Maccabean Wars, which are celebrated at Hanukkah. But in the end...
You had your fun. It's back to occupation for you, buddy.
Someone else was. This was true in Jesus' time. For example, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem, people were thinking,
could this man be the Messiah?
Maybe this Jesus guy could finally free them, overthrow the Romans, reclaim their territory, reestablish their former glory. But as we know now, Jesus didn't come to overthrow Rome, but to die in our place and show us how to live. That longing for a political Messiah didn't end with the crucifixion. It got passed from generation...
Could this be our new leader?
...to generation.
Our parents had it wrong. It's this guy.
Followers of Christ picked it up, carrying with them that sense that they were persecuted, and sometimes they were, and they sought either representation or domination, sometimes as a way to protect themselves, and others out of a desire for control. Flash forward. It was 1976. Jimmy Carter, a professing born-again Christian, won the presidency, and Pat Robertson was excited. Robertson was a televangelist whose show, The 700 Club and TV networks, brought in tens of millions of dollars. At this stage, he believed Christians should stay out of politics. At least, that's what he said in public. But now, Carter, a man of God, was headed for the most powerful office in the world. One of Pat's friends was told that if he could assemble a list of qualified Christians to fill some of the positions open in the new administration, Carter would take a look at it. Christians, handpicked by members of the clergy, would get in front of a president-elect. This was real access. Could mean serious changes. Robertson and his friends put together a list and flew it to Plains, Georgia. Imagine that. Pat Robertson said,
"We put together a list of potential appointees."
And
Carter rejected all of them.
Robertson, a man who thousands of people listened to each day, wanted to be heard. These influential evangelicals put on a big show about being separate from the world. But they didn't want to be separate from the culture. They wanted to be the culture. And when they thought they had a shot at it with Carter, when they saw their latest political messiah and Carter didn't pick their side, it hurt. Rather than admit political action wasn't working, they kept trying. Every people group wants to be represented. That's not unique to these guys. But the road ahead was a bumpy one, full of scandals, compromises, and odd twists. We're focusing on two guys, Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, as they tried and sometimes failed to maintain the momentum of the early 80s, seeking a political messiah, a righteous, upstanding man who could represent them, or, barring that, a deeply flawed figurehead who could force their small government views on the country. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. It's the Regency Hotel in New Orleans, a large corporate-looking building with a tower. Very flashy. A heavy-set man endorses his friend for president.
Pat Robertson is one of us. And that doesn't necessarily mean the right church the right particular persuasion, but it does mean the same purpose and the same cause.
This is an actor recreating a speech by Jimmy Swaggart, another of the television preachers throwing his full weight behind the Robertson campaign. Offering advice, he even offered that his son Donnie could be on hand to liaison with the campaign committee to keep communications open. Since 1985, Swaggart had denounced the excesses he saw in charismatic TV preachers, with their gimmicks and over-the-top emotion. Now, he endorsed Pat Robertson's bid for the big chair. The kind of endorsement that sounds great at the time, but soon became an albatross, as behind the cameras, things got personal. Let's get to know Jimmy Swaggart a little better. He fancied himself the kind of preacher who could call out his peers for their moral failings. For example, in 1986, Swaggart invited Marvin Gorman, yet another televangelist, to his home.
Thank you for meeting today, Marvin.
He knew this man had cheated on his wife, and according to him, wanted to reach out in love, to call him to repentance. The story broke and Gorman fell from glory, losing much of his money. He sued Swaggart for $90 million. So that didn't go so well. This wasn't the only time Jimmy Swaggart tried to hold someone accountable. He did something similar with Jim Bakker,
Thank you for meeting today, Jim.
alerting the denomination when he found out about the man's affair. To some, this looked like dirty infighting. Swaggart was accused by his critics of engaging in a ratings war by eliminating his competition, even though, as one of his staff put it,
"There's not a pocket in this country where Jimmy can't be viewed."
And then Swaggart got into hot water of his own. On October 17th, 1987, a Lincoln Town car pulled into a seedy motel just a few hundred yards from Swaggart's church. It seemed that a gentleman had been frequenting low-rent motels in the area, careful to check in under the woman's name, always sporting hats, sunglasses, headbands, doing a bad job of disguising himself. This time, someone tailed the vehicle. They snapped photographs of Jimmy Swaggart wearing different clothes, sneaking around with a prostitute. The photographer placed a call to Gorman, that guy who'd been brought down by Swaggart, and told him to get down there. According to a reporter from the Toronto Star, the two preachers had a confrontation in the motel parking lot. Only this time, the tables were turned. Swaggart, who'd exposed multiple philandering ministers, was now the one begging for discretion. And he didn't get it. And the world knew that Jimmy Swaggart had fallen. Maybe you can see how this was bad news for Pat Robertson's campaign for president. 3 of his peers, Swaggart, Jim Bakker, and Gorman, were exposed as adulterers. The Bakkers were under investigation for fraud. He was trying to gain the trust of Republicans in an era when the GOP was more concerned about marital fidelity than it is now. They were preaching family values, while also hiding secrets. After Robertson's initial success, things started to sputter out. His fellow Christian celebrities failed to rally their followers for him. Tim and Beverly LaHaye backed Jack Kemp. Falwell supported VP George Bush. Bill Bright of Campus Crusade for Christ, Billy Graham, and James Dobson of Focus on the Family hesitated to choose a side out of fear of losing their tax-exempt status. Chuck Colson, who'd participated in the Watergate scandals, a Christian author and broadcaster himself, didn't want his legacy to rub off on Robertson. Pat wanted support from his cohorts and crickets. While his peers were quiet, his opposition was loud. As biographer David John Marley claimed,
"Not since George Wallace ran for the Oval Office had a candidate been the subject of such angry opposition."
remember George Wallace, the racist governor of Alabama? The opposition hit Pat in the press by calling out, for starters, the more extreme of his charismatic beliefs, like a claim that his prayer had diverted Hurricane Gloria, something that was, at best, impossible to prove. When comparisons to other media preachers arose, Robertson preferred to distance himself from the term televangelist, though that's what he was. But thanks to guys like Swaggart, televangelist was toxic. So Pat wrote to his donors,
I am a religious broadcaster, an educator, a businessman, a minister, but never have I been called by God to be an evangelist. It is a wonderful calling, but this was not my calling.
There was also his support of the Nicaraguan Contras, and his distaste for Congress cutting their funding. CBN's Operation Blessing was known as one of the
biggest contributors, raising millions of dollars for food, medicine, clothing, vehicles, and other aid for so-called Nicaraguan refugees, who also happen to be Contras.
We evangelicals like to remind people that the Bible tells us to obey the governing authorities. But somehow, we also like to justify overthrowing governments. I'll never understand that. There were also claims made by the Robertson organization that the Soviets still had missiles in Cuba, that the Bush campaign was behind the Swaggart revelations, and that CBN had known the location of the hostages in Lebanon. All of it made Robertson seem kind of out there. Perhaps the biggest hurdle was that Pat and his wife conceived their first son out of wedlock. Something, again, in the 1980s was a big deal to Republicans, even though the Robertsons had not been saved at that point. On Super Tuesday, Robertson got just 14% of delegates. Headlines declared that his invisible army of Christian voters failed to materialize. According to one study, his religious supporters didn't fit the term evangelical, but were limited to people in the Pentecostal or charismatic camps, essentially a fraction of what was already a niche. On May 16, 1988, he suspended his campaign. He endorsed George H.W. Bush and got to speak at the Republican National Convention, being introduced to the theme song from Rocky, which for copyright reasons, we won't be playing. George Bush Sr. would also not be the political messiah. Robertson returned to the Christian Broadcasting Network immediately after ending his run. Despite the best efforts of his son, who led things in his absence, CBN was losing its audience. The problem with empires built on charismatic figures is that when the leader leaves, it's hard to maintain momentum. Also, the donors were split between supporting the network or his campaign. With Pat back in front of the camera, their donations were again aimed in one direction. As he had been in the Carter and Reagan eras, Pat Robertson was hopeful. I mean, surely Christians would be appointed to prominent positions in the George H.W. Bush White House, right? After all, as he said, Bush was a
genuine conservative and a deeply religious man.
But by the end of the appointment process, Robertson was, for the third time, disappointed. These politicians who he'd so vigorously endorsed, Carter, Reagan, Bush, had not come through. He said,
leading evangelicals are beginning to express their displeasure that conservative evangelical Christians have virtually been excluded from any meaningful positions in the government.
He believed that the country needed Christians. Well, conservative Christians. Well, his kind of conservative Christians to step up and run the American government, starting from the local offices and going all the way to the top. In a White House meeting in November of 1989, President Bush made a comment that it was difficult to identify qualified evangelicals to appoint. Robertson got a big laugh when he replied,
"You have no difficulty identifying evangelicals and their allies during the campaign, but you cannot find them after the election?"
Without a campaign of his own, Robertson still wanted to get out there, to dabble in politics. The plan was pretty simple. Start an organization to fulfill the promise of the moral majority. Get Christians elected to offices. Only this time, he'd make important changes. As Robertson said,
the moral majority had been politically ineffective because it was essentially a direct mail fundraising machine.
It began in 1989, when he hired a young PhD candidate named Ralph Reed to start the Christian Coalition. Reed was a disciple of the New Right's Paul Weyrich, even reaching out to him before taking the job. Weyrich, as you'll remember, was the guy who coined the term moral majority, and had been involved in their founding and that of the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation being the people behind President Trump's marching orders known as Project 2025. In 1990, they gathered the usual suspects, many of whom had met a decade earlier to panic over the presidency of Jimmy Carter. You remember the New Right, right? Robertson and Reed became friends with Falwell and his staff. But their tactics were far more organized. One major contribution was their voting guides, which suggested to people who they should vote for. These were designed to be stuffed into church bulletins and handed out, something that jeopardized the tax-exempt status of the churches who participated, because conservative Republicans were disproportionately favored. And the coalition honored some of the legends of the religious right. In a speech before the Christian Coalition in 1994, Robertson praised the work of a woman who had established so much for them, Phyllis Schlafly, saying,
"If it were not for this lady, we would have had homosexual rights written into the Constitution."
We've kind of lost touch with Phyllis Schlafly this season, but she continued writing and applying pressure long after the Reagan administration. The Christian Coalition also hosted the Road to Victory Conference and Strategy Briefing, where Republicans seeking office were given a platform to appeal to religious voters. You know, make politicians kiss the ring. In the mid-1990s, they claimed 1.9 million members, 2,000 local chapters, and $27 million. It's okay to be wary of those stats. By 1996 and 1997, Fortune magazine listed the Christian Coalition as 7th on its list of leading lobby firms, ahead of the Chamber of Commerce and American Medical Association. For all the bluster of the moral majority in the early 80s, the Christian Coalition of the 90s had a lot more influence, even if it doesn't have the same cultural recognition now. And speaking of the moral majority, it burned white hot for a short time. But as the 1980s came to a close, it had reached the end of the road. Here is Daniel K. Williams, historian and author of God's Own Party.
Something happened in the 1970s, and it's unquestionably true that large numbers of white evangelicals did become loyal Republicans. But how much of that was due to Falwell and how much of that was due to larger currents is, I think, a matter that could be debated. I think that Falwell was important, but had he not existed, I'm not sure that everything would have been radically different. There were a number of other people trying to do the same thing. He happened to be the most successful representative of this larger movement. But the reason that he was successful was because he was able to step into a situation in which the groundwork had already been laid for this larger cultural shift. I think Falwell could have kept the moral majority open if he had wanted to, but his own enterprises had fallen on hard times in the late 1980s. So with Jim Baker and Jimmy Swaggart, Falwell, while he was untouched directly by those scandals in the sense that there was never really any hint of a sexual impropriety on his part or no major moral failing, nevertheless, those scandals had taken a toll. The broadcast ratings for all televangelists went down in the late 1980s. There was kind of a disillusionment. Bush appointed some people to Health and Human Services and other agencies that were overtly pro-choice. It seemed like he was going to be moving the Republican Party away from the Christian right. And there was a sense that Falwell had that maybe the time had come to close this down, that it wasn't as effective. More than anything, I think he felt like it was taking its toll on his church, that his church had grown rapidly in the 70s and it had not by the end of the 1980s, that he needed to focus on his church, he needed to focus on his college, that he could not do all things. And the political ventures had seemed exciting while they were going on. They were very exhausting. He was logging long hours on the road. He discovered what I think most people in the Christian right have discovered before and after that, certainly after that, which is that politics is a very frustrating business. If your goal in politics is to change the culture, his strategy of the moral majority had reached its natural end.
The moral majority closed its doors in 1989, with Falwell's refrain being, quote, "Our mission is accomplished," end quote.
I feel that I have performed the task to which I was called in 1979. The religious right is solidly in place, and, like the galvanizing of the black church as a political force a generation ago, the religious conservatives in America are now in for the duration.
I can't hear this story and not think of future President George W. Bush. standing on an aircraft carrier in 2003 with a banner behind him reading, "Mission Accomplished." On that day, the president celebrated American strides in Iraq. The irony being that the conflict had only just begun. Falwell and the moral majority, though they loom large in our imaginations, are only the tip of the iceberg. Conservative Christians, especially those on the far right, still had a long way to go to reach their goals. When we return from the break, we'll see how all this played out for Pat Robertson and the Christian Coalition, as they struggled with their own mission accomplished moment. While you listen to the ads, why not leave a review of the show on your podcasting app? 5 stars would be great, and some nice words would be even better. Okay, here come the ads.
This message comes from the Enneagram and Marriage podcast. Have you wanted to improve your relationship, but you're running out of ideas, time, or even interest? I'm Krista Harden, the host of the Enneagram and Marriage podcast, and I've dedicated the last 2 decades of my life and career on couples research, integrating healthy faith practices with the best of marriage research and nuanced personality typing. Couples from all over the world are finding more value-centered joy and bringing healthy desire, love, and fun back into their bond together again or for the very first time as they work strategically and intentionally on repatterning their love in healthy ways. Join us on Mondays or Wednesdays to listen and learn more about how your life and relationship can truly thrive together.
Welcome back. In this episode, we're following the demise of the moral majority and what happened to Pat Robertson after his run for president. The Christian Coalition won some big fights. No surprise, several protecting the tax-exempt status of their own organization and churches that participated in it. Remember, a lot of this is about economics. The coalition reached its peak during the Clinton impeachment hearings in the late 90s, as Robertson was heavily sought after for his comments. He saw Bill Clinton as, can you guess? A secular humanist. Remember that old jab? But ironically, Robertson approved of Clinton's political appointments, something he couldn't say for Carter, Reagan, or Bush. By the late 90s, the organization was in financial trouble. Robertson blamed some of the failure of the Christian Coalition on local field operators being unwilling to campaign hard, a lack of urgency. But more likely, it was Robertson's control of the board, where only his ideas were chosen, making the organization inflexible. Robertson left leadership in 2001, among continued financial troubles. The coalition failed to pay even low-level contractors like limo drivers and security for their events. They folded in 2006 under debt. Ralph Reed claimed that they had failed because they succeeded. It was hard to get Christians riled up about politics because, it seemed, Republicans, whose demise was predicted in the 1970s, had taken power by moving to the far right. Though the president in the early 2000s, George W. Bush, was not their political messiah either. Once again, as he had for every president in the last 20 years except Democrat Bill Clinton, Pat Robertson complained about his appointments. He said to Karl Rove,
"It has come to me that the White House is not interested in having the help of the coalition in grassroots organizing. Is this rumor, in fact, true?"
Yeah, it was. Both the moral majority and the Christian Coalition had a hard time once they were perceived to have succeeded. Conservative Christians had been told that if they got Reagan or Bush in office, all their problems would be solved. But once those guys ran the show, the public, voters, grew disinterested. Thinking they'd won, they took their ball and went home, meaning a sharp drop in interest in both organizations, though in different decades, teaching them and the new right that it wasn't enough to simply organize discontent. You had to organize perpetual discontent. Just a few more notes on Robertson before we go. He, like so many of these evangelicals with large followings, held business in high regard. He loved him a side hustle. One was Regent University and its law school. If you're an evangelical, you gotta have your own college. Another venture was the American Center for Law and Justice, which advocates for Christians in instances of perceived discrimination, like for protesters of abortion clinics or access to public school grounds. Their star lawyer was, for a long time, Jay Sekulow. Sekulow had a popular radio program and helped the George W. Bush administration pick justices for the Supreme Court. More recently, he defended Donald Trump in his first impeachment case, as well as fighting efforts to keep him off the ballot in 2024. Robertson also had a string of failed businesses, like the oil refinery in California from the last episode that lost $60 million, a gold mining operation in Liberia, where he partnered with the president there who was charged with crimes against humanity. He also acquired a timber concession in Zaire and gave support to a string of brutal dictators. In 1990, Pat even tried his hand at multi-level marketing, selling coupons, which then, of course, transitioned to vitamins. That venture, too, somehow lost money. Upon his death in 2023, Robertson's estimated worth was around $100 million. Let's tie all this together. Historian Justin Watson points to a genuine sense of victimization among evangelicals of this era. They fed on the sense that they were somehow both the majority, a moral majority, if you will, and an oppressed minority. They carried that feeling of living in an occupied territory that I started the episode with. That mythology of persecution allowed them to rally people to their cause. But it's also a dangerous tightrope to walk. Because if someone can convince a Christian that they are persecuted, they can also urge them to forget what Jesus said we were to do under persecution. Turn the other cheek. Bless those who persecute you. Instead of that stuff, they dug their heels in with the hope of gaining, as they said, a place at the table. Robertson, Falwell, and their kind had an unenviable task: to try to bond a diverse group together to seek power. By claiming to be the people of God, they expose themselves to extra ridicule because the standards are so much higher for religious people. At the same time, they began their journey by saying that the country's problems were caused by homosexuals, liberals, and secular humanists. They were the moral people and others were the sinners. Except maybe for the string of sex scandals. To accomplish their goals, they attached themselves to a liar, a star of TV and movies, a divorced man who slept with many women, who slashed the government, pushed for low taxes, made friends with big money interests, deregulated the economy, polluted the environment, blamed the poor, and exploded the national debt. I'm talking, of course, about Ronald Reagan. We won't go much beyond this era this season. We've mostly covered the 1970s and 80s. But the 90s are a fascinating time as coalitions grew stronger, fears over the end of days reached a fever pitch, R.J. Rushdoony's homeschooling efforts exploded, Francis Schaeffer's faulty vision of history took root, constitutional originalism spread in conservative circles, and evangelicals started worshiping leadership as never before. The religious right tried to gain control, but succeeded under Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Bush to get a few scraps, which only pushed them to grow more radical in their search for a political savior. Not someone who would lay their life down for others as Jesus did, but someone who would wrestle power and oppress their enemies by whatever means possible. This episode used a lot of sources. Special thanks to Daniel K. Williams, author of God's Own Party, for his interview, as well as John Wigger, whose book is PTL, The Rise and Fall of Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker's Evangelical Empire. I'm also indebted to Francis Fitzgerald's The Evangelicals, Pat Robertson, A Life and Legacy by David Edwin Harrell Jr., Primetime Preachers by Jeffrey Haddon and Charles Swan, Rick Perlstein's excellent books, and a host of newspaper articles from the era. I'll do my best to list all the sources in your show notes and on the website. Thanks to everyone who gave me their voices for this episode, including Bob Stevenson, Josh Griffith, Kenneth Forte, and Chris Sloan. Ministries sometimes get out of control. They get money hungry. They seek too much power. I'm working hard to keep Truce on the right track. For me, that means not getting too big for my britches, staying humble, and trying to do things the right way. That still takes money. I'm doing this job full-time on a shoestring budget and would love to hire some help someday. And next season is shaping up to be a big undertaking. We can make this happen. Not so we can take over the world, but so that more people can hear the call to return to the gospel instead of seeking earthly power. If you want to be part of making that happen, visit trucepodcast.com/donate to learn how. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truce.